Hello, everyone. So, lately, gentlemen, we have been talking about in the MGTOW community about how there's been this debate over the validity of evolutionary psychology. So I figured I would weigh in on this subject with the disclaimer that I have not, at this point, watched the various videos that have sprung up on the subject. I think that I took a look at John the Other's first video on the subject and haven't really listened to anything that everybody else has been talking about, and I don't even really remember the John the Other video. This is going to be more of just a random ordered script, if you will. It's intentional that I didn't listen to everybody else, since I believe that it helps me to reach outside the box conclusions more often when I don't know what anyone else is saying on the subject. And so the following then should be considered nothing more than a stream of consciousness, one in which arguments that may have already been raised and discarded may make an appearance, and in which preliminary ideas that may even be contradictory may be expressed. So you can consider this an off-the-cuff freestyle, I guess. I want to make the claim that if you find things that are inconsistent, arguments that are faulty, go ahead and eviscerate them in the comment section. I don't really care, since I'm not invested in any one theory or framework. Evo-Psych is something that I believe in and use, but it's not something that I believe in so rigidly that I'm afraid to, acknowledge if I don't know everything about it. Evo-Psych is something that's very complex, and I admit right off the bat that I don't know everything regarding this discipline. So, one thing that I want to stress then, and we'll get right to business, is that because a science or a scientific theory is not completely falsifiable, to me this does not mean that it is not a theory worth pursuing. There are many, many theories that we take as fact and extend validity to that are fundamentally untestable, but are backed up by so many mathematical formulas and similar, but maybe not identical experimentation that it is taken as credible. We can talk about the theory of the Big Bang, for example. We have these laws of physics that explain how matter interacts in the universe on the quantum and macro scale, and we have other physics models detailing forces, things such as gravity, the weak nuclear force, etc., that tell us how matter should have acted in the first billionths of a second following the Big Bang. We observe the cosmic microwave background. We observe the fact that galaxies appear to be moving away from each other at rapid speed, and thus we arrive at a conclusion, given all of this evidence, that the Big Bang occurred somewhere within the scope of 13.7 billion years ago. However, the question remains as to how one actually tests this claim. Can we take all the matter in the known universe and concentrate it down into a single infinitesimal point and observe it right before it explodes? Can we do that? No, we can't. Generating the sheer amount of energy that is required to do this, if it's at all possible, is of course beyond the technological capabilities of human beings, and likely beyond the capabilities of anything human beings will evolve into the future. Even if we could take all of the matter in the universe and restructure it into something that would simulate the Big Bang perfectly, this would require the decomposition of the atomic arrangements that make up every single human being to ever exist, including all of the heavier elements that make up human beings, the things like carbon and phosphorus, etc., that form the backbone of our DNA makeup. All of these elements would have to be reverse engineered back to hydrogen, right? And even then, the hydrogen itself would have to eventually be turned back into whatever it was that existed before hydrogen, in whatever it was that existed before the Big Bang. So this renders human observation completely impossible, because the heavier elements that make up human beings technically wouldn't even exist. Iron, phosphorus, carbon, etc. And even if they did exist somehow, they would certainly not be arranged in such a way that it would make up billions of human beings that were capable of observing the Big Bang from within the pre-existing conditions before the Big Bang. So the best that we can do is to simply exist as conscious matter that eventually formed as a result of the Big Bang, and in doing so we can interact with other matter in our particle accelerators, and we can tinker around with that, attempting to smash together particles in such a way that closely simulates the conditions immediately following the Big Bang. And yet, there is enough theory and enough mathematics and enough controlled particle acceleration and enough of an understanding of physics to allow us to tell ourselves that we have a pretty good amount of information that tells us this is how the Big Bang likely happened. And as we move forward into the future with the discovery of the God particle, the Higgs, and all of these other types of exotic matter, and once our understanding of things like dark matter and dark energy progress, I think that we will have an even more robust understanding of this. So given that, we accept this theory and we believe in it. Now, the theory of evolutionary psychology is very similar in this regard, although I concede that the degree to which the theory of evolution is untestable is much more pronounced than that of the Big Bang in some respects. The main aspect of unfalsifiability in the theory of evolution surrounds the fact that Evo-Psych is not something as simple as to be encapsulated in an elegant mathematical equation like the physical interactions of matter that existed immediately after the Big Bang could be. Technically it is. Technically we can make an equation that would plot out every atomic interaction that ever occurred from here to this point, but we certainly do not have the means to devise this equation, right? If we're all just matter, and the various arrangements of matter that human beings take creates this set of behaviors that we understand to be consciousness, then every interaction of matter, and thus consciousness, could theoretically be accounted for and predicted. All we would need to know is exactly what consciousness is and its relationship to the way physical matter is orientated in space. So the proper statement is that Evo-Psych isn't unfalsifiable, but it is instead untestable with the technology that we currently have available to us. In order to test Evo-Psych, we would need several things. We would need the understanding of the relationship fully between consciousness and matter, I described earlier. We would need a planet identical to Earth in every way, and we would need 13 or so billion years of observation time, and we would need a computational device capable of measuring all of the variables at play in the development of life on this identical planet. This device would also have the ability to make sense of and compile 13 billion years worth of data. If we had that, we could pinpoint exactly why the matter in the earliest forms of life did what it did in reaction to its environment, and continue this process until we could pinpoint exactly when the matter that made up life began to develop consciousness and instinct. We could then eventually tease out when proto-human beings started experiencing this consciousness, and given our theoretical or hypothetical complete understanding of the relationship between consciousness and matter, we could start to tease out in a definitive way what evolutionary forces developed our current human psychology. This, again, simply is not possible for our species, technologically speaking, at this point in time. But that doesn't change the fact that there, in fact, is a human nature and a human psychology that has been formed over the course of this 13.7 billion year journey that has resulted in our species, as well as, of course, the known universe, and all of the life contained therein if we're not alone in the universe. It is our anthrocentric hubris that allows us to believe otherwise. We are the sum total of constant rearrangements of matter in the form of genetic mutations interacting with the environment, and the environment itself is really just another level of constantly rearranging matter itself. In this constant flux of matter rearrangement, we observe patterns. We observe arrangements of matter that make up human beings, which replicate other human beings. Our behaviors, which again are dictated by some sort of relationship between matter and consciousness, should then be definitively relatable in some way to that relationship. And thus our brains has also been molded in an ordered way by 13.7 billion years of atomic rearrangement. We call this eternal dance of atomic rearrangement evolution, specifically when dealing with the rearrangements of matter that create biological organisms. This then validates, I think, the concept of Evo-Psych, and solely the concept, right? There is such a thing as human nature based in evolutionary psychology. That I believe to be the reality. But another beast entirely is the science of evolutionary psychology. The science of evolutionary psychology represents the sum total of thoughts that our species has dedicated in regards to this process of 13.7 billion years of matter rearrangement, and how that constant rearrangement of matter culminated in bipedal apes, whose biological imperative is to replicate itself over and over again. So the science is the sum total of our investigation into this process. I wish to make a clear distinction between our concept or occurrence of an evolutionary process that must have resulted in a human species that has an essential nature molded by reproductive drives, and our attempts to understand that process, which again is what I refer to as the science as opposed to the concept of evolutionary psychology. Now, in order to attempt to bridge the gap between the concept of Evo-Psych and the science of Evo-Psych, or should I say, in order to attempt to know the difference, is to, by its definition, speculate. Given our knowledge of this 13.7 billion year process, as well as the question as to how the arrangements of matter that make up conscious human beings have been influenced by this constant biological imperative to replicate ourselves in a way that maintains this elusive thing, this mysterious thing we know as consciousness, it is to speculate. And that last part, the last part about, the fact that we want to replicate not just the matter that makes us up, but our consciousness specifically. Yes, that's a little bit of a philosophical speculation on my part. But I do believe that that is what we seek to replicate. We seek to replicate consciousness, specifically the arrangement of matter that allows for it, instead of simply just reproducing organs and flesh and all of that. We fear diseases like Alzheimer's disease because on a subconscious level, we know that to suffer from this disease is equal to the degradation of the arrangement of matter that has allowed us to have the experience that we know as consciousness into another arrangement of matter that no longer will allow us to feel that, or to an arrangement of matter that only allows us the type of drastically reduced consciousness that is relatable to dementia or a vegetative state. We fear ultimately the permanent decomposition of the unique arrangement of matter that makes us us, and this is the process known as death. The matter, given that it is indestructible, that made up our bodies will remain forever, or at least it will remain until some sort of reverse Big Bang knocks off a few electrons in the carbon atoms that make us up, but that could take 1 trillion years if it even happens at all. For all we know, the universe could simply expand infinitely into inevitable icy death, spreading out all of the matter in existence over such a massive scale that each atom that ever bonded to another atom would be separated by a distance of light years. Or perhaps the universe and matter are infinite, and perhaps there are multiple universes, and the arrangement of matter that made up every human being to ever exist will one day happen again and again and again for eternity. Nobody knows. I certainly don't. So I acknowledge fully and completely right here and now that I could be completely wrong about all of this, or completely right, or partially right. But I don't have the tools or the intellectual capacity to prove any of it. But here's the kicker. Neither does anyone who says that Evo-Psych is complete nonsense. We stick then to what we know, or at least what we think we know. That after an initial Big Bang event, matter has been rearranging itself as per the dictates of mysterious forces such as what we've decided to call gravity, the weak and strong nuclear forces, and electromagnetism, the 4 fundamental forces as they're referred to in physics. And this process has culminated in arrangements of matter that can call themselves, have the capacity to call themselves conscious human beings. Given this information, we can theoretically conclude that there is, again, a conceptual basis for evolutionary psychology. The fact that we understand to a reasonable degree that there is some type of ordered process taking place that has led to matter creating conscious apes, and that any process where consciousness and ordered systems that drive them are in some way relatable will also conclude in an essential nature of that consciousness, an essential human nature. And thus, an essential human nature should also lead us to conclude that there exists an essential human psychology. If there exists an essential human psychology, and there are 2 types of humans, male and female, we can also conclude that there is an essential male psychology that co-evolved alongside an essential female psychology. What I mean to say is that the fact that we cannot measure the progression of evolution, and thus the progression of human consciousness with any degree of exactitude, does not discount the existence of an evolutionary progression of events that is relatable to human psychology. It is said that the game of poker is a derivative of the Persian game of asnas, which very well may be a derivative of something else. Now, I don't know the history of chance-based card games, but I'm going to speculate here and assume that we have had something resembling poker or some version of it going back hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. If you imagine 2 human beings that lived 700 years ago playing some type of proto-poker, you could imagine that they would think that this game was, for the most part, a random one. That although some strategy could be employed, it was mostly a luck of the draw thing. And then a few centuries go by and the human species starts to develop the science of mathematical statistical analysis. And by the time we get to the 1970s, we have developed a science that has allowed what was once a game that was universally believed to be mostly random to be mastered by a bunch of 20-something MIT students implementing an ordered process of card counting. Meaning that at one point, the two humans playing their proto-poker 7 centuries ago did not have the computational and scientific theory necessary to reach the understanding that there is much more order than we would think surrounding these seemingly chance-based card games, and thus they likely concluded that the degree of randomness was a lot higher than it actually was. But the fact remains, however, that the degree of randomness was fixed. It was instead the science of the time that was lacking. And it was the continual application of speculative reasoning that allowed us to eventually discover the increased amount of predictability surrounding these games. Those two players, 700 years ago, not having the science to know if the game could be proven to be a lot less random than they could prove it to be at the time, nonetheless used speculative reasoning to deduce that it must follow some type of order, that there's a set number of variables and thus a set number of outcomes. And they knew this intrinsically, but they eventually acquiesced to the fact that they didn't have the tools necessary to prove it completely, so they left it alone. But that inkling and that suspicion persisted in the consciousness of human beings. It didn't go away. And we used these simplistic and obvious conditions, that is, that there's a set number of variables and a set number of outcomes to speculate until eventually we advance our understanding enough to definitively prove it. So that's what you call informed hypothetical speculation. That's what we do with Evo-Psych, in my opinion. We do not have the tools to map out exactly how we evolved and exactly how this process has shaped our innate nature, but we have used what we do know, the fact that we have determined existence to be the sum total of a constant rearrangement of matter, as a basis for concluding that there must be an essential human nature. Since we cannot conclusively prove the exact process and thus the exact essence of the end result of this, we are left with Evo-Psych, which is speculative reasoning based in the fact that we know an evolutionary process has happened, but that we lack the technology to spell out exactly how it has happened. So we then developed a hodgepodge of useful assumptions that are based on what we know must have happened. That is, that evolutionary process, that shaping process. And so we work backwards from there, trying to tease out some semblance of understanding from a set of conditions that may only be partially understandable. And yes, this does create an environment where conclusions may be reached that are either correct or partially incorrect, however you want to phrase it, or even completely incorrect. But these speculations are not useless. They are in fact extremely important and potentially critical if we want to one day develop theories that allow us to understand Evo-Psych at a level that we once thought impossible. It's, again, I've talked about this before. If you look at the science of calculus, right, and once you start learning about limits, the limit as x approaches infinity, for example, right, you have to do mathematics based off of how things would appear if we were approaching on the x-axis infinity. You don't actually, of course, because it's impossible, you don't actually count out infinity and observe what happens there, because that simply we can't do that, right? It's a theoretical framework, but we don't really know what happens as we approach infinity in these mathematical equations unless we counted them out. Where do you start counting infinity? And is infinity plus 1 or infinity minus 1 smaller than infinity? You see, these things are theoretical frameworks that we don't even know if they're true, but they allow us to derive useful information if we assume that they're true. In its essential nature, science involves simple observation of your environment and formulation of a hypothesis about things that you've observed in your environment, followed then, of course, by testing to rule out or support our hypothesis. So we have observed the environment and for the most part have concluded that we've evolved through this process of natural selection, which again is a simple, ordered, and constant rearrangement of matter following the rules of natural selection. And so since we believe evolution to be a factual accounting of how our species got here, we're now left with the daunting task of teasing out the possible ways this process has shaped us in the psychological sense. But we, of course, barely understand our psychology because we barely understand our consciousness and our brain and our neurology. So we are left with a period where informed speculation is not only necessary, but likely the only real option we currently have at our disposal. This informed speculation, Evo-Psych as we know it, should not be done away with simply because we can at this point only partially test them at best, since that is the point where the speculation forms the fertile topsoil where increased understanding can potentially come from. So then, at this point, we are left with the possibility that our exploration into Evo-Psych proceeds from a false premise. But that possibility comes also with the knowledge that this process of speculation is simply a progression of understanding. Our descendants may look back on what we're doing now here with Evo-Psych, and in comparison to what they understand in their time, they may look upon our understanding of it with an almost alchemical quality. Perhaps they'll say that we were trying to transmute a golden conceptualization out of the base metals found in the theory of evolution. But perhaps they will also look back and say, well, look, they were onto something here. They had an inkling of what was the case here and here and there, and this inkling eventually flourished into what we understand to be the case now. Another possibility, of course, is that we will never have the capacity to completely understand the evolutionary forces and variables that shaped us, and that we're relegated by the forces of nature or God or, the Spinozan God or whoever put us here or whatever put us here to exist just under the cusp of an ability to understand our own capabilities of understanding. Whatever the case may be, I do not consider it, though, to be a fruitless endeavor to continue a study of evolutionary psychology, or even to erect a framework that potentially proceeds from a false premise or two surrounding evolutionary psychology, so long as that premise arises from an understanding that an essential nature must have coalesced in this 13.7 billion year process of evolution. So therefore, in regards to gender, I simply do not think it is possible that men and women have evolved such different morphology, with one gender developing a penis and the other a vagina and the reproductive systems that accompany them both, while also developing absolutely no differences in behavior and psychology whatsoever. And I'm talking about innate differences, of course. What we have to understand, then, is that when different groups of human beings are under selective pressures from the environment, the random genetic mutations that those human beings pass on when they reproduce are going to be either deselected or selected by the environment. That's easy and simple enough to grasp. But when it can be definitively observed that women have a more developed corpus callosum than men, or that men have a significantly larger inferior parietal lobule, or that women have a more robust deep limbic system, then I think it becomes safe to conclude that due to the fact that we know there are anatomical differences in the brains of men and women, it is likely that there are also innate behavioral differences as well. I've just never understood how we can conclude that because a serial killer is missing this or that bit of neurology, and that this seems to be some kind of trend amongst serial killers, we can then conclude that because they don't have this bit of neurology, then we say that, they lack emotions as complex or misunderstood as empathy, or that they're a sociopath or what have you. But then once it's shown that men and women have demonstrable differences in brain anatomy, we strain ourselves to downplay this in hopes of what I can only guess is not hurting women's feelings. I'm no neurologist. I don't pretend to be. I'm not in any way implying that I have a deep understanding of neurological anatomy, but I do raise that point, right? Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe the studies that I've referenced in terms of the differences between male and female brain anatomy can be disproven. And if they are, I'll be the first to say so right here. But the argument that I'm making is that if we can prove inherent anatomical brain differences between men and women, I think it's a safe conclusion to draw that men and women have innate psychologies and natures. So again, brain anatomy and differences in brain anatomy are poorly understood. Nobody is denying this, but I don't believe that they are so completely misunderstood such that no conclusions can be drawn. But therefore, and here's the caveat here, any conclusions that we reach regarding the anatomical differences between gender, or even between race, or even between individuals, should be explored. We should never shy away from that. But we should also, given our limited understanding of neurology and the brain, we should also never ever use this knowledge that we have to subhumanize or dehumanize anybody, be it race or gender or individual, ever. And that, I think, is a fair and beneficial way to use Evo-Psych. And I don't think that we should throw it away. And I don't think that we should throw away the possibility that these anatomical differences can very well help us to understand a lot of our behavioral differences to varying degrees, even if we can never fully understand them. Or we won't be able to for, I don't know, decades or hundreds of years. Now, I can pose the argument that we can look at other species and argue that a chimpanzee has an essential nature, and that male and female chimpanzees have also evolved essential natures and proclivities based off of their gender. And I could theorize that this means that human beings must also have essential natures, that there must be an essential female and male nature present in human beings as well. But this could be rebutted by saying that human beings are the only animals capable of the type of sentience that we do have, and that any comparisons to other members of the animal kingdom are rendered useless because of this fact. So given that argument, a key question worth asking then is as follows. And that is the question, when does it become possible for human beings to speciate? And if human beings ever did speciate, would these two branches of hominids have definitively different natures, given that they both came from the only known organism that possesses this advanced type of sentience? And this question is already partially answerable to a degree. I mean, let's say it became possible to clone a Neanderthal, right? Or that exotic new species of hominid they discovered, that like pygmy species. I believe they're called the Denisovans or something, Denisovans or something, right? And let's say that we found in some Arctic tundra somewhere a piece of salvageable Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA, and we clone these people, right? And these are hominids, and these are hominids with arguably something approaching the type of consciousness that we have. Likely, it's very probable that we have more intelligence than a Neanderthal, but who knows? We weren't there, right? And let's say we clone them, and we study them, and we compare them to our behavior, and these people demonstrate a type of behavior that, despite us socializing them and bringing them into our civilization, they seemingly cannot shake. Would that then be a part of their nature? And if we started creating colonies and even nations of Neanderthals, right? And they demonstrated a cross-cultural tendency for certain behaviors. All of this is hypothetical, just, a stream of consciousness, thinking out loud type of stuff. So again, rip it apart if you want. If you find problems with it, don't really care. If we observed cross-cultural behaviors, despite them having the same socialization as us, at what point could we point to them and say, okay, this is Neanderthal nature. This is Denisovan nature. I recently read an article saying that when we finally do colonize the red planet, the fact that Mars has 1/3 the gravity of Earth as well as other factors could, given enough time, change the descendants of the colonizers of Mars into a new hominid species altogether, distinct from Homo sapiens sapiens. Perhaps we would call them Homo sapien martianus, I don't know. But the first new generations of Martians would resemble a highly exaggerated version of our first ancestors that left the African continent, that went on to develop European or Asian genetics or whatever, after long-term generational exposure to different environments. The first generation of Martians would develop a different bone density throughout their lives due to the decreased gravity, and those humans that had the genetics best suited toward adapting under the environment that causes low bone density would be more likely to reproduce, given that we weren't living perpetually under simulations that simulated perfectly the gravity of Earth, right? So assuming that once colonizing Mars, we basically said we are going to have to get used to the decreased gravity and didn't live in encapsulated glass globes or whatever. You know what I'm talking about, the prototypical Mars community. Given that we existed under this decreased gravity, those suited towards a low bone density lifestyle would be more likely to reproduce and thus would reproduce. This would continue until it bled into the social and cultural fabric of the subsequent Martian generations. Martian sports, for example, would account for lower bone density and lower gravitational pull. Martian, circadian rhythms would adapt as well. And so that would start the cultural biological feedback, right? Where biological organisms that are most suited towards a lower bone density environment would reproduce. The culture would then move naturally to correct for that discrepancy in gravity from Earth to Mars. And then the culture would reinforce the biology would reinforce the culture, and, again, this would continue perpetually until eventually, maybe, perhaps, it wouldn't even be possible for human beings from Earth to reproduce with these Martians. The fact that one Mars year is 687 days long as opposed to our 365-day Earth year would result in cultural practices in tune not with the earthen solstices, but instead with those of the Martian planet, and eventually the Martian human brains, after enough Martian genetics were passed down, would become neurologically wired to the 687-day Mars year and the Martian seasons in some unforeseen way. And this could eventually manifest somehow in their nature. We could, at one point, I don't know, millions of years into the future, granted that Earth and Mars are still vibrant colonies of human existence, we could bring the Martians back after having had evolved under that presence, and they would seem to us diminutive, bring with them their own calendars and their own propensity to stick to that calendar. I mean, that's how it would happen, I think. And eventually these Martians might have their own nature. And eventually Martian women and Martian men could perhaps interact very differently than men and women on Earth do so, seemingly naturally, even if we took them away from Mars. So anyway, these are just a bunch of thoughts that I've been meaning to get out surrounding this topic. To conclude, I do not think Evo-Psych should be discarded, and I will continue to use it, even though I acknowledge that it is an imperfect model. But more sufficient, I believe, than a model which relies solely on social or environmental explanations for human nature. That's all I really have to say, gentlemen. Thank you for listening.